You haven't written this sort of as a dramatic novel, but there are passages in it that do read like that. Why did you decide to write the book in the first place? Because it's proved to be a very controversial book.
So if I can just turn these questions around, the reason why it's proven to be controversial, I think, is that the people who don't want the story to be told had their rebuttals planned months ago. And I know this because I know people who were in discussions with them. And the rebuttals were, well, as soon as it's out, we're going to say it's a work of fiction, it's a fantasy. And then because they've done that kind of almost made it blow up. And the thing is, it's not actually my book here. My photograph isn't even on the jacket. It's a book of interviews with very many people. Some have been condensed, 2 or 3 people into one, with very many people who told me this. I had no idea when I started this book what I was going to find out. No idea. I think you would have had more of an idea than me when I started writing this. I didn't even know who these people were. I'd never heard of Mark McGregor. I'd never heard of Dougie Smith. I'd heard of Dougie Smith because I'd had a kind of an interaction with him. But I had no idea of his role in the party, or how long he'd been around, or how long he'd been the payroll at Conservative Central Office, how he appeared on no staff list, how he was at Rishi's right-hand side, giving him all of his, how he'd been working 7 years to get Rishi to be Prime Minister. I knew none of this. You probably knew some of it. I didn't. So I started writing
And you were in the cabinet.
Yeah. So I started writing this book completely knowing something really odd. So I knew 2 stories. And I thought, but these are completely untrue. What is going on? So, and then something happened to me, which I detail in the book, about my advice note being changed to the Prime Minister. And I thought...
Well, since you mentioned that now, just explain that, because that is truly one of the most shocking things in the book, where you as Culture Secretary had to appoint a new chair of Ofcom, one of the biggest regulators in the country. I mean, other they regulate us.
One of the most important roles
Absolutely.
in the country.
So just take us through what happened there, because it is truly shocking.
So there had been an interview process for a new head of Ofcom. When I arrived as Culture Secretary, it had been set up by Oliver Dowden. And I was informed by, it goes through, there is a kind of a Shawcross report, and when Shawcross oversees how this process takes place, and I was constantly reassured as Culture Secretary that everything, that's one of the first things I want to know, is the process absolutely watertight. And I was told that the committee had found 2 people to be eligible for the role of the chair of Ofcom. One of them was Lord Michael Grade, who has chaired Channel 4, BBC, ITV, held a number of regulatory jobs and chairman's jobs. And I wasn't surprised. He was almost an auto-grad. And then the second person they told me marked equally with him was a chap called Lord Stephen Gilbert, who has worked in Conservative Central Office for 25 years. He's just been a backroom boy in Conservative Central Office, ran Theresa May's disastrous election campaign. And I just couldn't get my head around why the committee was telling me that these 2 men scored equally. It was like comparing chalk and cheese, or, apples and pears. So I said, OK, well, I'm going to choose Michael Grade.
But you hadn't been involved in the interview process yourself?
No, I'd arrived, this process had taken place under Oliver Dowden. I arrived and it had been done. So so what you do as a Culture Secretary it's the Prime Minister's appointment. He can appoint anybody he wants, but he goes through the process and asks you as his Secretary of State to give him the recommendations. So in my red box, the Prime Minister, in his red box that night, I put an advice note in which said, Prime Minister, been through the Ofcom regulator chairs process. This is the person I recommend to be head of Ofcom. What happens is the next day the Prime Minister reads that and he signs it off, and it goes back into the Cabinet Office, comes back to me at DCMS, and the appointment's made. Anyway, very early the following morning, very early, I got a telephone call from somebody who I will never reveal, in number 10, who said to me, I think you need to know that your advice note to the Prime Minister in his red box last night was removed from his red box and it was changed. And another person's name had been put in there, and the person's name had been put in there was Stephen Gilbert. So I telephoned the Prime Minister and I said to him, he was on his way to see the Queen, and I said to him, we need to have a conversation. This is what has happened. And he said, OK, tell me now why, because he was confused as to why it happened to himself. He said, tell me now, why do you want Michael Grade? And I went through the reasons why I wanted him and Michael's, list of eminent qualifications for the role. And he said, you're my Secretary of State. That's your recommendation. That's who will be the chair of Ofcom. And I think it was his private secretary in the back of the car that he turned to and said this to. And then a few days later, Michael Grade was appointed. But before we got to that stage, I received a number of telephone calls from Munira Mirza, who is the wife of Dougie Smith, and then from Dougie Smith.
And head of the Prime Minister's policy unit at the time.
Yeah, and then from Dougie Smith saying, you have to appoint Stephen Gilbert, not Michael Grade. And the phone call I got from this man, Dougie Smith, who I'd never spoken to in this thick accent, Scottish accent, was intimidating. He was basically telling me that I had to appoint Stephen Gilbert and not Michael Grade. And I just could not understand why. Why would I appoint Stephen Gilbert? The man is not qualified. We're bringing the online safety bill through. We've just given them £34 million to get themselves set up to regulate the online safety bill. We need someone who's got regulatory experience and has got experience of chairing a huge organisation. Why would I do that?
So someone basically ripped up your letter and wrote a different one, presumably with your signature on the bottom.
I think what they did was they crossed out the name Michael Grade and wrote the name Stephen Gilbert in on my advice note.
And who do you think did that?
I'm never going to say because...
do you know?
Yeah.
Why won't you say?
I do know. Yeah, I do know.
Why won't you say?
Well, I believe that it was Dougie Smith.